If I should ask you to tell me what this picture represents, I'm sure most of you would say, oh, that's a nuclear power station. And that's correct, but only partly so, because it really represents much more than that. It represents a practical way to cope with what we've come to know as the energy crisis. Within the universe, we live in isolation. All space beyond the limits of this tiny planet is hostile to man. Apart from sunlight, we receive no help from outside. Unless we tap resources in other planets, we must make do with what we have in the world. And some of our resources, once used, cannot be renewed. We can cut trees for lumber, for paper, or for energy as firewood, and then reforest and cut again. But every lump of coal, every drop of oil, every puff of gas once burned is lost forever. Coal, oil, and gas, these are the traditional sources of energy, the so-called fossil fuels, and our isolated little planet contains only a limited amount of each. So far in our use of these fuels, it must be admitted that society has followed a deliberate policy of waste, a policy of maximum consumption, regardless of necessity, efficiency, or national priorities, a policy dictated by comfort, taste, profit, and expediency. We have become a throwaway society. Now the first signs of our foolishness, the first signs of the approaching depletion of these valuable resources are making themselves apparent. The headlines you see, you have also seen in newspapers: shortages, rationing, skyrocketing prices, Sunday driving bans, lower speed limits, lower thermostat settings, and so on. What is the answer to the dilemma? Energy is woven through the whole fabric of our society. We cannot get along without it. What then will supply energy in the future in quantities at least as large as at present for the developed nations and in much larger quantities for underdeveloped countries? Only one alternative source of energy has demonstrated that capability: nuclear power. That is the Pickering Nuclear Power Station. In capability, it's one of the world's largest. In terms of production, efficiency, and reliability, it is number one, and it is Canadian-designed, built and operated by Canadians, and serving Canadian electrical needs. To duplicate its output during 1973 with power from a fossil fuel station would have required 7.5 million tons of coal, or 1.1 million gallons of oil, or 194 million cubic feet of gas, because 1 pound of uranium fuel is equivalent to 24,000 pounds or 12 tons of coal. Most Canadians have heard of the resounding success of Pickering, but because of its recent and sudden prominence in the news, some may have assumed that Canada is a relatively new arrival on the international nuclear scene. But that's not so. From the earliest days of nuclear development in the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom, Canada has been involved. Ernest Rutherford, one of the fathers of modern-day nuclear physics, did much of his work at McGill University in Montreal during the early 1900s. He discovered many of the basic properties of radioactive elements, first postulated the structure of the atom as we know it today, and drew attention to, as he put it, the enormous amount of energy which could be obtained from a small amount of matter. Later, during World War II, a nuclear research establishment was founded at Chalk River, Ontario. Its primary function was to carry on investigations, begun earlier in France, of nuclear reactions using natural uranium with a heavy water moderator. At the same time, a small plant was set up in Trail, British Columbia, to produce heavy water. During these war years, the first reactor in the world began operation in Chicago on December 2nd, 1942. Canada was the world's second nation to own and operate a nuclear reactor when the ZEEP reactor at Chalk River achieved a controlled chain reaction on September 5, 1945. After the war, the research at Chalk River, still concentrating on the combination of natural uranium and heavy water, continued under the direction of the National Research Council until the newly formed Atomic Energy of Canada Limited took over in 1952. ZEEP was followed by two additional research reactors at Chalk River, the NRX, which began operation in 1947, and the NRU in 1957. But for Canada, 1954 was a major turning point. In that year, a decision was made to explore the possibility of using this new technology for the production of electricity. From that decision, we progressed to the demonstration plant, NPD, started up in 1962, to the prototype station, Douglas Point, in 1967, and to the large commercial Pickering plant in the 1970s. Each station 10 times the size of its predecessor. Also brought online in the early 1970s was the Gentilly plant in Quebec, a prototype of another variant of the Canadian nuclear system. This is termed CANDU, for Canada Deuterium Uranium. So today in Canada there are 7 CANDU power reactors in operation and 19 others under construction or planned. All 26 reactors are centralized at 7 locations. Their combined electrical output would be equivalent to Canada's entire generating capability in 1955. Abroad, 2 research reactors and 5 power reactors have been sold, and all but 3 of the power reactors are now in operation. For many people, nuclear power, although an accepted reality, remains shrouded in mystery. A CANDU nuclear reactor is simply a type of furnace used to produce the high-pressure steam that rotates the turbine in windmill fashion and drives the generator to produce electricity. The fuel is natural uranium. Unlike a coal, oil, or gas furnace, the heat does not come from the process of combustion. It comes from friction and is generated within the uranium itself by the continuous splitting of atoms, which raises the temperature of the fuel as high as 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. An atom of any material, including uranium, is composed of a core or nucleus made up of a specific combination of protons and neutrons, around which a number of electrons move in an orbiting pattern, much as the planets move around the sun. When a uranium atom is struck by a free neutron, it splits into pieces which fly apart with great energy and create heat in collision with neighboring atoms. Also at this moment of fission, radiation is given off and 2 or 3 free neutrons are released. In natural uranium, there is a small amount of spontaneous fissioning going on all the time, and from this natural process come the initial neutrons required to start the chain reaction. The reason why the chain reaction occurs only when the fuel is in the reactor is because the reactor contains another essential ingredient, the moderator. As the 2 or 3 free neutrons are ejected from the splitting atom, they travel at great speed. Much as a bullet must be slowed down before it will shatter rather than just make a hole in a pane of glass, so the neutron speed must be reduced or moderated to about a mile a second before they will readily split other uranium atoms. Heavy water is the most efficient moderator known. It looks, tastes, and feels the same as ordinary or light water, but weighs about 10% more. The difference lies in the type of hydrogen atoms contained in each substance. Ordinary hydrogen and oxygen combine to form ordinary water, H2O. Heavy water, D2O, is a similar combination of heavy hydrogen, also called deuterium, and oxygen. The nucleus of ordinary hydrogen consists of 1 proton only, while heavy hydrogen has a nucleus of 1 proton and 1 neutron, and therein lies the extra weight. Heavy water occurs naturally in our rivers, lakes, and oceans in the proportion of 1 part heavy water to 7,000 parts of light water. Here at Niagara Falls, for example, 320,000 gallons of heavy water pass over the falls each hour. There are 2 plants in Canada presently engaged in the extraction of heavy water, one at Port Hawkesbury, Nova Scotia, and the Bruce plant at Douglas Point, Ontario. Within the next few years, the Bruce complex will be expanded, and 2 new plants, one in Nova Scotia and one in Quebec, will be brought into production. It is the combination of heavy water moderator and natural uranium fuel that makes CANDU unique among the world's commercial power reactors. Natural uranium is found in abundant quantities in Canada. The uranium compound is formed into pellets approximately 1 inch in length and about half an inch in diameter. During their 18-month stay in the reactor, each pellet produces enough electricity to supply the average home for about 3 months, and each reactor at Pickering contains over 3 million pellets. They're sealed in metal tubes which are bundled together in groups of 28 and placed in the fuel channels that honeycomb the reactor. Outside the channels, the heavy water moderator, shown here in orange, fills the reactor. Inside the channels, a cooling fluid, also called a heat transport fluid, shown in blue, circulates and absorbs heat as it passes over the hot fuel bundles. In the Pickering reactors, the cooling fluid is heavy water. The fluid then moves on in a closed loop to the heat exchanger and then back to the reactor. As it passes through tubes in the heat exchanger, it gives up its heat to ordinary water, which is in turn converted to steam. This is the basic CANDU system, although there are other variations of it. It is referred to as a pressure tube system because the coolant fluid in the channels is kept under a pressure of over 1,200 pounds per square inch to prevent it from boiling. Other types of reactors in common use around the world fall into two broad categories: gas-cooled and light-water reactors. They use a less efficient moderator, graphite for the gas-cooled and light water for the other, which means that the fuel has to be enriched in uranium-235 content to sustain a chain reaction, an extremely expensive process. A new type of reactor is under development in a number of other countries, principally the United States, Britain, Russia, and France. Termed the fast breeder reactor, it is fueled with a mixture of plutonium and uranium, and while it operates, it produces more fuel than it burns. This is achieved by surrounding the core of the reactor with a non-fissionable type of uranium. Fast neutrons escaping from the edge of the core bombard the uranium and convert a substantial portion of it to a fissionable type of plutonium, which can be recycled back to the reactor as fuel. Fast breeders may be in commercial operation in the late 1980s. The CANDU reactor is sometimes referred to as a near breeder. It produces some fissionable plutonium, but not in large enough quantities to be self-supporting for fuel. Future variants of the CANDU system are expected to complement rather than compete with the fast breeders. However, until breeders are a proven technology and are in commercial operation in large numbers, it must be remembered that supplies of uranium are not limitless and they can be depleted. And herein lies one of the important advantages of the CANDU system. It uses less uranium to produce a given amount of energy than any other established reactor system in the world today. For example, compared to light water reactors, it can produce twice as much energy per pound of uranium. What we are witnessing today is another stage in the evolution of society's energy base. In 1850, about 90% of our energy was derived from wood. 50 years later, at the turn of the century, coal was the dominant source of energy, accounting for over 70% of the total. Over the next 50 years, by 1950, oil and natural gas had moved into the lead, supplying more than 50% of our energy needs. Now that percentage has continued to grow until today it stands at about 75%. But the signs of their decline appear all around us. In the meantime, nuclear energy appeared on the scene in the 1950s, became established in the 60s, and now is steadily increasing its contribution to the energy pool each year. The conclusion is inescapable. Nuclear energy is here to stay, and in the not-too-distant future, it will be the dominant source of electric energy. The natural question then is, what will it be like to live with? Is it safe? How will it affect our environment? It's not possible in the time available to give the subject of nuclear safety the treatment it deserves. That would have to be a subject of a separate presentation. However, I will attempt to provide a rough overview without which a general discussion on nuclear power would be incomplete. To begin with, some people wonder about the possibility of a nuclear explosion occurring at a nuclear power plant. Let me assure you, this is impossible. It cannot happen. None of the conditions necessary for a nuclear explosion are present in a power reactor. As to the general question of safety, there has never before been a technology subjected to such stringent safety measures. Simply put, serious accidents have never had the opportunity to occur in a commercial reactor. As a result, the industry today enjoys a safety record unsurpassed by any other. In Canada, the Atomic Energy Control Board is charged with the responsibility of setting and enforcing the restrictions within which the industry operates. The AECB standards are based on the expertise of an independent international body of prominent scientists, the International Commission on Radiological Protection. The AECB's concern is many-faceted and covers the entire spectrum of siting, design, construction, and operation. Each of these stages is scrutinized in detail by the board, and their rigid standards must be met before the next stage is permitted to proceed. Reinforcing the regulations and controls of the AECB are the safety features of design, construction, and operation of the station. The reactor buildings are designed and built to be leak-proof. In addition, the air pressure inside the buildings is kept slightly below atmospheric pressure, so that should a leak develop in the shell of the building, it would be a leak into, not out of, the structure. As a further precaution, the Pickering reactor buildings are connected to this large vacuum building by a duct with valves which open automatically. The vacuum building has a large dowsing tank of water at roof level, and as its name implies, is kept at close to a perfect vacuum. In the unlikely event that the most serious, hypothetically possible accident, a rupture of one of the main heat transfer pipes, should occur, steam from the reactor building would be sucked into the vacuum building and condensed by a water spray system from the roof reservoir. Other safety measures include triplicated protective systems, filters in the air conditioning systems, duplicate backup equipment, and a continuous training program for all personnel. Supervisory personnel must pass stiff qualifying exams set by the AECB. After about 1.5 or 2 years in the reactor, radioactive spent fuel is removed and stored in underwater bays located in the power station. The bays look like swimming pools about 20 feet deep. They can hold about 10 years' supply of spent fuel from the station's reactors. Eventually, the fuel will be removed and stored in buildings designed particularly for that purpose, and perhaps even later underground. At specially managed and monitored sites, other radioactive wastes are either stored safely or destroyed, depending on their level of radioactivity and their composition. Actually, there's nothing new about radiation. It's as old as time. Man has always been subjected every day of his life to radiation from outer space in the form of cosmic rays, from the soil, rocks, concrete, bricks, and other building materials around us, even from other people, for man himself is radioactive to a certain degree. In total, this is referred to as background radiation, and it varies from place to place with the local geology and the altitude. In fact, a person would have to live on the boundary of a nuclear station for a year before he would be exposed to as much radiation as one would receive from cosmic sources during a transcontinental return air flight. The permissible levels of radiation for the general public are conservatively set by the AECB at 4 or 5 times the average level of background radiation. It's significant that monitoring programs in the areas adjacent to Canada's nuclear plants have shown no essential change in the background dose levels. Also significant is the record of the Canadian nuclear power industry. There has never been an injury from radiation, either to a member of the public or to a worker in the nuclear generating station plants. How then will nuclear energy affect our environment? In short, it will be cleaner. No smoke, no soot, no smelly discharges. It will be quiet. No large cargoes or stockpiles of fuel. It will be green. A part of this plant site is parkland, and it will be economical. Once the plant is built, the price of electricity produced is relatively stable, not affected by the widely fluctuating costs of fossil fuels. And it will add to the total industrial capability of the nation. At the present time, there are hundreds of companies directly involved in Canada's nuclear program. For instance, over 900 contributed to the building of Pickering. The total investment in the industry exceeds $4 billion, and the number employed is more than 100,000, and the future looks bright. Domestic orders for power reactors are on the increase. More heavy water plants are being built, and still more will be required. With Pickering as proof of our nuclear pudding, international markets are beginning to open up. For Canada alone, the latest forecast of nuclear generating capacity in the year 2000 is 130 million kilowatts, 2.5 times today's total hydroelectric, fossil-fueled, and nuclear capacity combined. But CANDU's contribution to the future can't be measured in dollars, jobs, and kilowatts alone. Its contribution toward the conservation of fossil fuels is most important. It took nature 600 million years to lay down these resources. And yet, within the span of a few hundred years, which in geological time is almost infinitesimal, man will have consumed all but a few percent. For example, the world's leading experts forecast that the production of oil will peak sometime in the next 25 years and then decline until 60 years from now. Only 10% of the original reserves will remain, and these forecasts make allowance for future discoveries. Conservation of the remaining reserves is imperative when we consider their other uses as an irreplaceable source of hydrocarbons. To name a few: transportation, lubrication, asphalt paving, roofing, plastics, insecticides, and synthetic fibers for fabrics. Another beneficial side effect of nuclear power, one which I mentioned earlier, is improvement in the quality of life by reducing air pollution. All of these things considered, it's not surprising that a world consensus has developed that nuclear power has arrived just in the nick of time.